Death Comes in Fives, featuring Inspector Price and Jane Parsons. Please like, share and subscribe to our full-length audiobook channel. It is appreciated. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Halloway Manor. It was a damp and dreary morning when Inspector Price received the letter. The post had been late that day, held up by the heavy autumn rains that had turned the cobbled streets of London into treacherous puddles. He sat at his desk in Scotland Yard, a steaming cup of tea untouched beside him, and turned the envelope over in his hands. The paper was thick and fine, sealed with a crimson wax crest, an unmistakable symbol of Halloway Manor. His eyebrows knitted together. It was not every day that Sir Reginald Halloway, an elusive aristocrat with a reputation for being as shrewd as he was secretive, extended personal invitations. With a flick of his penknife, Price slit open the envelope and withdrew a single sheet of parchment, the handwriting precise and deliberate. "Inspector Price, I require your presence at Halloway Manor immediately. A most urgent matter threatens my household, and I fear lives may already be in jeopardy. The matter is delicate and must be handled with the utmost discretion. You will not be alone in this endeavour. I have also extended an invitation to Miss Jane Parsons, whom I believe you have worked with before. I trust you both will act swiftly. Time is of the essence. Arrive before nightfall. Sir Reginald Halloway." Price exhaled sharply. Jane Parsons. Now that was interesting. He had crossed paths with the private detective before, and he had come to respect her keen observational skills. She was perceptive, bold, and, most annoyingly, often right. If she was involved, this would be no ordinary case. With a shake of his head, Price downed the last of his tea and reached for his coat. The journey from London to the Hampshire countryside was an unpleasant one. The rain showed no signs of relenting, and the train compartment was stifling with the heavy scent of damp wool and tobacco smoke. Price leaned against the window, watching the landscape blur past. Across from him sat Jane Parsons, looking infuriatingly composed. She was wrapped in a dark green travelling coat, her sharp grey eyes focused on the book in her lap. "I assume you received the same letter?" Price asked, breaking the silence. She turned a page without looking up. Indeed, it would appear Sir Reginald has a talent for cryptic summons. "You know him personally?" "I've met him on occasion. Wealthy, eccentric, not fond of company. He's been abroad for some years. Egypt, I believe, dabbling in antiquities." She closed her book and studied him. "And what do you make of it?" Price sighed. Either he's a paranoid old man jumping at shadows, or he truly believes someone intends to do him harm. Jane smirked. "And which do you prefer?" "I prefer a quiet evening by the fire, but here we are." The train jerked to a halt at a tiny mist-shrouded station. A black motor car awaited them, its driver standing stiffly beside it. Without a word, they were ushered inside, and the vehicle lurched forward, winding through narrow, fog-choked roads. By the time Halloway Manor emerged through the gloom, the evening was settling in. The house was vast and imposing, its grey stone facade veined with ivy, its turrets disappearing into the mist. Golden light flickered from the great windows, but the effect was more eerie than welcoming. The butler, a solemn man named Hargreaves, greeted them with a bow as they stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood, aged paper, and something faintly metallic. The entrance hall was grand, with a sweeping staircase and a massive chandelier. Sir Reginald was waiting for them in his study, seated in an overstuffed leather chair. Age had not softened him. His face was gaunt, his eyes sharp, and his fingers drummed against the armrest in agitation. "You came," he said simply, nodding to both of them. "Good. There's no time to waste." "Your letter was rather vague, Sir Reginald," Jane said, removing her gloves. "Perhaps you should begin with what exactly threatens your household." Sir Reginald exhaled loudly, then gestured to the table beside him. Laid out in neat rows were 5 identical letters, written on yellowed parchment. "They began arriving a week ago," he said, his voice low. "One each day, each one saying the same thing." Jane picked up the topmost letter and read aloud. "5 lives for 5 sins. The first falls tomorrow night. Then one by one they shall follow. You will not escape what you are owed." Price whistled under his breath. "Who would want you dead, Sir Reginald?" The old man gave a humourless chuckle. "A better question would be, who wouldn't?" He stood and walked to the window, staring into the darkness beyond. "Everyone in this house has secrets. I have secrets. And someone, it seems, has decided the time has come to settle old scores." Price exchanged a glance with Jane. As the evening wore on, the guests assembled for dinner in the grand dining hall, their faces drawn with unease. Each of them had received a similar invitation from Sir Reginald, though none admitted to knowing why. Seated around the long mahogany table were Dr. Francis Lindley, whose sharp gaze missed nothing; Mrs. Lillian Winthrop, adjusting her pearl necklace nervously; Victor Halloway, arms crossed, looking brooding and suspicious; Miss Eleanor Marsh, scribbling in her notebook; Alfred Pemberton, the financier, who seemed oddly amused by the whole affair; Lady Agatha Halloway, pale and withdrawn. The air was heavy with tension. The conversation was forced, full of awkward starts and stops. Each guest eyed the others with caution, as if trying to determine who among them might be a threat. And then, just as the servants cleared away the last plates, a piercing scream rang out from the corridor. The room exploded into chaos. Chairs scraped, gasps filled the air, and Inspector Price and Jane Parsons were already on their feet, racing toward the sound. The heavy oak door to the drawing-room was ajar. Price pushed it open, and there, slumped in an armchair, was Edwin Blackwood. His face was frozen in shock. His fingers were locked around a crystal glass of brandy, and he was dead. Chapter 2. The first murder. The barrister falls. The scene of death. The silence that followed the scream was brief. The moment Inspector Price and Jane Parsons entered the drawing-room, chaos erupted behind them as the guests crowded at the doorway, whispering in hushed, horrified tones. Edwin Blackwood, London's most cunning barrister, sat motionless in a grand armchair, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. The brandy glass in his hand had slipped slightly, resting precariously between his rigid fingers. Jane stepped closer, eyes narrowing as she observed the scene. The expression on Blackwood's face was one of pure shock, his eyes glassy and mouth slightly open, no sign of struggle, no obvious wounds, just stillness. "Was he poisoned?" she asked quietly. Price picked up the brandy glass and sniffed. The scent of almonds was unmistakable. "Cyanide!" A collective gasp rippled through the doorway. Dr. Francis Lindley pushed through the gathered onlookers, his physician's instincts overriding his shock. He knelt beside Blackwood, placing 2 fingers against the man's throat out of habit, then checking his pupils. "Gone. Rigour hasn't set in. He must have died moments ago." Jane took a closer look at the glass. The amount of brandy left was minimal. He had nearly finished the drink. "Did anyone see him take a sip?" she asked, her voice firm. The room was silent for a moment before Victor Halloway spoke up. "He poured it himself just before dinner ended. Said something about needing a real drink before heading upstairs." Price stood up, scanning the room. "And where was the bottle?" "On the sideboard," said Alfred Pemberton, gesturing toward an elegant decanter of brandy near the fireplace. "The same bottle we were all drinking from earlier." Jane moved swiftly to the decanter, opening it and taking a careful sniff. No almond scent. "The bottle isn't poisoned. That means the cyanide was already in his glass before he drank it." Price's expression darkened. which means someone in this room killed him. A sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Lillian Winthrop broke the silence. But that's impossible. You saw him pour his own drink. Unless the glass itself was tampered with, Jane replied. Pemberton scoffed. Oh, come now, that's far-fetched. Not at all, Price countered. Someone could have prepared the glass beforehand and switched it with the one he picked up. Eleanor Marsh, the journalist, jotted notes feverishly. That means this was planned in advance. Someone must have known he'd take a drink after dinner. Sir Reginald, who had remained unnervingly quiet, finally spoke. There's more at play here than simple murder. This was a message. All eyes turned toward him. Message? Price asked. The old man's gaze flickered toward the table where the stack of ominous letters lay. The first had promised that a life would be taken that very night. The killer warned us, and now they've kept their word. With Blackwood dead, attention turned to those who might have wished him harm. Suspect number 1, Dr. Francis Lindley. As a doctor, he had access to poisons and the knowledge of how to use them undetected. Price fixed him with a hard stare. You were close to him? Not particularly, Lindley said, standing and dusting off his coat. But I have no reason to kill him, if that's what you're implying. You had access to cyanide, didn't you? Lindley crossed his arms. Most physicians do, but if I wanted to poison someone, I wouldn't use something so obvious. Unless, Jane added smoothly, you wanted us to think that. Lindley's face darkened. Are you accusing me, Miss Parsons? I'm considering possibilities. Suspect number 2, Victor Halloway. Victor, Sir Reginald's estranged nephew, had been heard arguing with Blackwood earlier in the evening. You and Blackwood? What was that argument about? Jane asked. Victor hesitated. It wasn't an argument, it was... He exhaled sharply. Blackwood was a barrister, and I needed his help. For what? Financial matters. Price narrowed his eyes. Blackmail? Victor's jaw tightened. That's none of your business. Jane exchanged a glance with Price. It was exactly the kind of evasive answer a guilty man might give. Price turned his attention to the remaining guests. Mrs. Lillian Winthrop clutched her pearls, still visibly shaken. I barely knew him. Eleanor Marsh scribbled in her notebook, excitement in her eyes. This is quite the puzzle, isn't it? Alfred Pemberton leaned against the fireplace, watching the room with amusement. 1 down, 4 to go, if the killer sticks to their pattern. Lady Agatha Halloway had retreated to the corner, looking pale. A death in this house, after all these years. It's happening again, she muttered. Price turned sharply. What do you mean, Lady Agatha? But the woman merely shook her head, refusing to meet his gaze. Jane pulled on a pair of gloves and carefully examined the glass again. There's a faint smudge on the rim, she murmured, as if someone handled it before Blackwood did. Gloves? Price asked. Jane nodded. Most likely. She turned toward the guests. Did anyone notice Blackwood hesitate before drinking? Lillian Winthrop spoke up, voice trembling. He sniffed the brandy before he drank it. Jane's eyes sharpened. Then why did he drink it? A heavy silence settled over the room. Price crossed his arms. He wouldn't have drunk it if he had noticed the poison, which means the killer was someone he trusted. A murmur of unease rippled through the guests. The second letter. Just then, Hargreaves, the butler, stepped forward, his face paler than usual. A message, sir, he said, handing a folded paper to Price. Jane and Price exchanged a look before Price unfolded it. The handwriting was identical to the first threatening note. The first has fallen, the second shall follow soon. The room fell deathly silent. Chapter 3. The Doctor's Demise. The heavy silence that followed the second ominous note lingered over the dining hall like an oppressive fog. The guests stood frozen, their faces pale and tense, staring at the piece of parchment in Inspector Price's hand. Sir Reginald Halloway, seated at the head of the table, had aged years in mere moments. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his wineglass, but he did not drink. His sharp, calculating eyes flitted across the room, searching for something or someone. "Whoever this madman is," muttered Alfred Pemberton, the financier, adjusting his cuffs, "they are enjoying themselves far too much." Jane Parsons ignored the murmurs and focused instead on Dr. Francis Lindley, the physician who had examined Edwin Blackwood's body. He stood by the fireplace, his face drawn and unreadable, staring into the flames. "Dr. Lindley," she said suddenly, drawing everyone's attention, "you're the only medical man here. Do you have anything to add about Blackwood's death?" Lindley turned, lips pressed into a tight line. "What more is there to say? Cyanide. Quick, effective. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing." And with that, the doctor left the room, making it clear he wouldn't answer any more questions. Jane studied him, watching him walk away. Next she looked at Victor, asking him what he knew about cyanide. All eyes turned to Victor, who scowled. "I didn't kill him." "Maybe," Price said, "but we have a killer among us, and if the second death is truly coming soon, we need to move quickly." At those words, a great crash rang out from the hallway. Everyone turned sharply, eyes wide with alarm. Something or someone had fallen. Price was the first to reach the hallway, Jane at his heels. The corridor was dimly lit by flickering gas lamps, their glow casting long, eerie shadows. The sound had come from the study. Price shoved open the heavy oak door, revealing a scene of horror. Dr. Francis Lindley lay sprawled on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. A scalpel protruded from his throat, gleaming in the candlelight. The physician's usually composed face was frozen in a final expression of shock and agony, his lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. For a moment there was nothing but stunned silence. Then the rest of the guests poured in behind them. Mrs. Lillian Winthrop shrieked. Victor Halloway swore under his breath. Eleanor Marsh scribbled furiously in her notebook. Sir Reginald, who had kept a stony silence throughout the evening, now exhaled heavily and muttered, "Two." Inspector Price crouched beside the body, his expression dark. "No doubt about it. The second victim?" Jane knelt beside the corpse, her sharp eyes scanning for details. The blood was fresh, meaning Lindley had been murdered only moments ago. The scalpel in his throat was thin and precise, a tool a doctor himself would use. His hands were clenched into tight fists, suggesting he fought back, if only briefly. There were drag marks on the floor, as if he had tried to crawl before succumbing. She stood and turned to Price. It was a silent kill. If he screamed, we didn't hear it, meaning the killer struck fast and efficiently. Price examined the scalpel. Irony at its finest. A doctor killed with his own instrument. Jane's gaze flickered across the room, and whoever did it is standing among us. The second murder changed everything. If Lindley had killed Blackwood, why would he now be dead? Unless... He wasn't the killer, Jane said softly. He was a target. The realization settled over them like a cold wave. Sir Reginald Halloway rubbed his temple. 2 dead, and yet no one saw a thing. Inspector Price turned to the group. "We need to go through everyone's movements in the past 20 minutes. One of you killed Dr. Lindley." Interrogation begins. Victor Halloway. "I was in the drawing room with the rest of you," Victor said firmly. "I left for a moment to get some air, but that was after we read the second note. I didn't even see Lindley leave." "Why would you have needed air?" Jane asked. Victor's jaw clenched. "You think I did this? I hated Blackwood, but I had no quarrel with Lindley. Unless he knew something, Price countered. Victor's eyes flashed. I don't like what you're implying. Mrs. Lillian Winthrop. The widow clutched at her pearls. I was in my room. I heard nothing at all. You seem very shaken, Jane noted. 2 people have died, Miss Parsons. And we're trapped in this dreadful house. Would you have me be calm? Eleanor Marsh? The journalist smirked, tapping her notebook. I was documenting everything. This is a once-in-a-lifetime story. Did you see Lindley leave? Eleanor hesitated. Number. But he was restless, kept looking around during dinner, fidgeting. Like a man expecting trouble, Price muttered. Alfred Pemberton. Look, I was in the library, Pemberton said, rolling his eyes. Reading, alone, is that a crime? That depends, Jane said. Did you ever have dealings with Lindley before tonight? Pemberton's smirk faltered. He was my doctor, that's all. As the questioning continued, Hargreaves the butler entered, his face grim. Inspector, another note has arrived. A heavy silence fell. Price unfolded the parchment. 2 have perished, but the guilty still walk free. Jane met his gaze. That means there's more to come. Inspector Price straightened. Then we need to act fast. For somewhere in Holloway Manor, the killer was waiting. Chapter 4. The Widow's Fate. A hush had settled over Holloway Manor like a shroud of fog. 2 had already fallen, Edwin Blackwood, the barrister, and Dr. Francis Lindley, the physician, and yet the murderer still walked among them, unseen, unheard, and entirely undeterred. Inspector Price stood in the dimly lit drawing-room, arms crossed, staring at the newly delivered 3rd letter, as though it might yield some hidden clue. Beside him, Jane Parsons scanned the faces of the remaining guests. The atmosphere had shifted from fear to near hysteria. Mrs. Lillian Winthrop, the wealthy widow, clutched at her pearls, her knuckles white. Victor Holloway sat stiffly in a chair by the fireplace, his face tight with anxiety. Eleanor Marsh, the journalist, tapped her pencil against her notebook, her eyes gleaming with a mix of fear and intrigue. Alfred Pemberton, the financier, lounged against the mantelpiece, trying too hard to appear unaffected, and Lady Agatha Holloway, Sir Reginald's frail sister, sat withdrawn, muttering to herself under her breath. "We must be vigilant," Sir Reginald finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "If these notes are to be believed, the killer will strike again." And he was right, because that very night a 3rd body would be found. The storm outside had not ceased. Rain lashed against the manor's grand windows, and a howling wind rattled the shutters. The guests, now too afraid to retire alone, had taken to gathering in the parlour. Inspector Price sat in a high-backed armchair, his pistol resting within reach. Jane Parsons stood by the fireplace sipping tea, her mind running over the details. The first 2 victims had been killed methodically, almost as if the murderer were following a pattern. Price finally spoke, breaking the tense silence. "We need to establish motive. What connects Blackwood and Lindley? Why were they killed first?" Victor scoffed. "You tell me, Inspector. We're all locked in this house together, yet we know so little about each other." "Perhaps that's the point," Jane murmured. "Perhaps the murderer knows exactly who their targets are, and they're picking them off accordingly." Mrs. Winthrop let out a trembling sigh. "What if they aren't stopping at 5? What if—" "Enough!" Sir Reginald cut in, slamming his cane against the floor. "I will not have my house turned into a stage for your hysterics, Mrs. Winthrop. We need clarity, not panic." A flash of defiance crossed the widow's face. "Easy for you to say, Reginald. You sit in your fine chair, issuing commands, while the rest of us are being hunted." Lady Agatha suddenly let out a soft laugh, startling them all. She murmured as if to herself, "The house is cursed, you know. I told you all before. It always comes back to the past." Jane's sharp gaze fixed on her. "What do you mean by that, Lady Agatha?" The older woman said nothing more, simply staring into the fire. It was Mrs. Winthrop, however, who abruptly stood shaking her head. "This is madness! I won't sit here waiting to be the next one." Before anyone could stop her, she stormed toward the door. "Mrs. Winthrop," Price called, "where do you think you're going?" "I need air," she snapped. "I won't be trapped in this room like an animal." Jane set her teacup down. "At least take someone with you." But the widow had already disappeared into the corridor. Price let out a string of curses. "Hargreaves," he called to the butler, "go after her. She shouldn't be alone." The butler bowed and followed in her footsteps. They would not see her again alive. 20 minutes passed. Then the scream came. It was Hargreaves, his voice filled with sheer terror. Price and Jane bolted from the room, followed closely by Victor, Pemberton, and the others. The scream had come from outside, through the grand entrance and into the estate's courtyard. The storm had eased just enough for the moon to cast a ghostly glow over the grounds. There, in the centre of the courtyard, floating in the stone fountain, was Mrs. Winthrop. Her lifeless body lay half submerged, her skirts billowing out like dark tendrils in the water. Her hands, unnaturally stiff, clutched at the stone edge as though she had tried to pull herself out. But she had failed. Jane immediately crouched beside the fountain, feeling for a pulse that was no longer there. "She's dead." Price turned to the butler. "Hargreaves, what happened?" The old servant, shaken beyond words, struggled to respond. I found her here, floating. I swear, sir, she was already gone." Jane scanned the area. "There are footprints in the mud leading away from the fountain. Someone was here before Hargreaves arrived." Price bent down, examining Mrs. Winthrop's lips. "She wasn't just drowned. There's a strange foam here." "Cyanide?" Victor asked. Jane shook her head. "Number something else." Price's expression darkened. Then the killer changed their method, which means they're improvising now. By the time they carried Mrs. Winthrop's body back into the house, tensions were on the verge of explosion. Sir Reginald, usually composed, slammed his fist onto the table. "This madness ends tonight. Someone in this house is playing a sick game, and I will have answers." "You think we don't want the same, Reginald?" Pemberton sneered. "We're all in the same damn predicament." "But not all of us are dead," Jane said, her voice cold. "Someone here is ensuring that 5 of us won't see another sunrise." Her words hung thick in the air. Inspector Price turned to Eleanor Marsh, the journalist, who had been oddly quiet. "Eleanor, where were you?" She raised an eyebrow. "You suspect me now?" "I suspect everyone," he replied bluntly. "Where were you in the last half hour?" "I was writing in my room alone." Victor scoffed. "Convenient." "And you, Mr. Pemberton?" Jane turned to him. He smirked. "Reading, as I said before. I'm quite dull that way." "What about Lady Agatha?" All eyes turned to the frail woman, who had gone even paler than before. I was in my chambers. I heard the scream, and I prayed it was just the wind." Price turned to Sir Reginald. "And you?" The old man's jaw tightened. "Drinking in the library, and considering how cursed this house truly is." Jane folded her arms. "Then we have no alibis. None of us." A terrible realization settled over the group like a funeral pall. The killer could be any one of them. And with 3 down, 2 more deaths were coming. As if summoned by dark forces, Hargreaves entered the room once more, his face stricken. "A note, sir," he whispered, handing it to Inspector Price. The inspector unfolded it, his face hardening as he read aloud. 3 have met their doom, yet vengeance is not complete." Jane and Price exchanged a glance. Someone in Holloway Manor was still hunting their next victim, and time was running out. Chapter 5. The Banker is No More. As Inspector Price and Jane Parsons stood over Mrs. Winthrop's lifeless body, the words from the fourth ominous note echoed in their minds. 3 have met their doom, yet vengeance is not complete. The remaining guests gathered in the drawing-room, their faces pale and drawn with fear. Sir Reginald Holloway, usually the epitome of aristocratic control, looked shaken. Lady Agatha Holloway, his fragile sister, sat hunched in an armchair, eyes darting wildly as she muttered incoherently. Victor Holloway, the disinherited nephew, paced like a caged beast, his fists clenching and unclenching. Eleanor Marsh, the ever-curious journalist, continued scribbling in her notebook, as if documenting the horror unfolding around her. Alfred Pemberton, the financier, leaned against the fireplace, his usual smug demeanour slipping into something more uneasy. "We are running out of time," Price muttered to Jane. "The killer isn't stopping. We need to find a connection between the victims." Jane nodded, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "There is a pattern here. We just haven't seen it yet." The air was thick with suspicion, and before the night was over, someone else would be dead. Later that evening, the guests hesitated to retire, fearing what might happen if they left the safety of numbers. But Alfred Pemberton was the exception. "All of this paranoia is nonsense," he declared, downing the last of his brandy. "If the murderer wants me dead, they'll have to come for me like a man. I refuse to cower in fear." Inspector Price frowned. "That's a foolish thing to say, Pemberton." The financier smirked, adjusting his cuffs. "You mistake my confidence for carelessness, Inspector." Jane, however, noticed something in his expression, an unease masked by arrogance. "You seem nervous," she remarked. Pemberton scoffed. "Wouldn't you be, Miss Parsons? People are dropping like flies, and frankly, I don't trust any of you, least of all that old man." He gestured towards Sir Reginald, who glared at him coldly. "You've been acting suspiciously since the first murder," Jane continued. "Is there something you're not telling us?" Pemberton hesitated. Then, with a sigh, he set his empty glass down and raked a hand through his hair. "Fine, you want the truth." His voice was lower now, more cautious. "I knew Blackwood, I knew Lindley, and I knew Winthrop." A ripple of surprise passed through the room. "Explain!" Price demanded. Pemberton exhaled. "Blackwood was handling a legal matter for me, something delicate. Lindley? Well, he was involved in that matter too, and Winthrop—" He paused. "Winthrop was blackmailing me." Jane's eyebrows arched. "Blackmailing you over what?" The financier hesitated again, then relented. "An investment gone sour. She had information that could have ruined me." "And you think that's why she was killed?" Pemberton gave a humourless chuckle. "I don't know, but if someone's targeting people involved in a certain affair, I'd wager I'm next." Then Victor scoffed. "You expect us to believe that? If you knew all 3, you have more reason than anyone to want them dead." Pemberton's eyes darkened. "Watch your tongue, boy, or you might find yourself next on the list." Jane and Price exchanged a look. Pemberton had motive, and if his name was tied to all 3 victims, he might indeed be the next target. Unfortunately for him, he was right. At some point in the late hours of the night, the manor had fallen into an uneasy silence. The storm had calmed to a light drizzle, and a deep fog had rolled in. Most of the guests had retired to their rooms, though whether they slept was another matter entirely. Then a gunshot rang through the house. Inspector Price and Jane raced toward the sound, their hearts pounding. Behind them, the remaining guests stumbled from their rooms, eyes wide with terror. The noise had come from the second-floor study, a room Pemberton had claimed as his own for the night. Price shoved open the door. Inside, the scene was gruesome. Alfred Pemberton lay sprawled on the floor, a gunshot wound to the chest, his blood pooling around him. His face was twisted in shock, his hand clutching at his shirt as if he had tried, desperately, to hold on. The pistol lay inches from his grasp. Inspector Price bent down, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. Then he exhaled. Suicide or murder? At first glance, the scene appeared to be a suicide. The gun was close to his body. There were no visible signs of struggle, and the door had been locked. But something was off. Jane stepped forward, her sharp eyes scanning the body. Look at his expression. He was surprised. People who take their own lives don't usually look surprised. Price nodded. And the gun, it's lying just out of reach, almost as if someone placed it there. Victor frowned. Are you saying this was staged? Jane's fingers ghosted over the wound. The bullet went through his chest, not his temple or mouth, not the usual method of suicide. And look at his right hand, it's clenched. Price carefully pried open Pemberton's fingers. Inside, there was something small and dark, a thread of fabric. Interesting, Jane murmured. He grabbed at something before he died, maybe even someone. Lady Agatha let out a trembling sigh. 4 gone, 1 more to go. The room fell silent. Sir Reginald, who had remained unusually quiet, turned to Price and Jane. We must find the killer before the next victim falls. This must end. Price folded his arms. Then we need answers, and we need them now. As if on cue, Hargreaves the butler entered, his face grim. Another note has arrived, Inspector. Price unfolded the parchment. 4 are gone, yet the puzzle remains unsolved. Jane tapped her chin. The killer isn't just committing murders, they're enjoying this. Price's jaw tightened. Then we're dealing with someone who won't stop until they've completed their twisted game. Victor exhaled sharply. That means we still have 1 more murder coming. The realization sent a chill through the room. 1 more victim, 1 final death, and the true killer was still among them, watching, waiting, ready to strike again. Chapter 6. The Final Murder. The tension in Halloway Manor had reached its breaking point. 4 had fallen: Edwin Blackwood, Dr. Francis Lindley, Mrs. Lillian Winthrop, and Alfred Pemberton, and yet the killer remained unseen, lurking within the walls of the grand estate, awaiting their final victim. The latest note had left Inspector Price and Jane Parsons unsettled. Somewhere in this house, the murderer was waiting to strike one last time. Price set the note down on the great oak table in the drawing-room, where the remaining guests had gathered, their eyes darting between one another. Fear had taken full hold of them now. No one trusted anyone. Sir Reginald Halloway, his face pale and drawn, stood stiffly near the fireplace, as if bracing himself for another death. Lady Agatha Halloway sat in an armchair, her hands trembling as she murmured about past sins and ghosts that would not rest. Victor Halloway, restless and irritable, kept pacing back and forth, and Eleanor Marsh, the journalist, sat apart from them all, her fingers tapping impatiently on the edge of her notebook, her eyes gleaming with something close to excitement. Inspector Price's gaze swept the room. We now know that each of the previous victims was connected in some way, he said. Blackwood, Lindley, Winthrop, and Pemberton all had dealings with each other. Jane nodded. And yet their deaths were carefully staged, each one seeming almost like poetic justice. The barrister poisoned, the doctor stabbed with a scalpel, the widow drowned, the financier shot. Each murder, in a way, suits its victim. Victor scoffed. So we have a killer who's not just methodical, but theatrical. Price's voice was grim. Which means they won't stop until they've completed their twisted plan. Eleanor Marsh, who had been uncharacteristically silent, suddenly spoke. "So the last victim." She trailed off, glancing around the room as if assessing her chances. No one dared answer her question, because no one wanted to be next. The storm had passed, but the night air was thick with mist, curling around the manor like a creeping spectre. No one dared to sleep. Victor Halloway insisted on sitting near the fireplace, his arms crossed, glaring at anyone who so much as looked at him suspiciously. "This is madness. We can't just sit here waiting for the killer to pick one of us off." "Would you rather wander the halls alone?" Jane asked coolly. Victor scowled but said nothing. Eleanor, meanwhile, seemed oddly unaffected by the danger surrounding them. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her notebook with her pencil. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I've covered a lot of crimes in my time, but this is the first time I've been at the centre of one." Sir Reginald turned to her, his expression cold. "You sound almost amused, Miss Marsh." She smiled faintly. "I suppose I am. This is the sort of thing that makes history after all." Inspector Price narrowed his eyes. "You seem very confident that you won't be the next victim." Eleanor tilted her head. "Do I?" There was something in her tone that set Jane on edge. Before she could press further, Lady Agatha suddenly let out a low, trembling moan. "They won't stop," she whispered, rocking slightly in her chair. "The sins of this house, they always come back. We are all damned." Price frowned. "Lady Agatha, what are you talking about?" But the old woman only shook her head, muttering to herself. Eleanor gave a smirk and scribbled in her notebook. Now that's an interesting quote. Jane had the distinct feeling that Eleanor Marsh knew more than she was letting on. As the night dragged on, the guests remained together, waiting for the next strike. Then, just as the great clock in the hall chimed midnight, Eleanor Marsh stood abruptly. "I can't take this any more," she declared, stretching her arms. "Sitting around, waiting to die, it's ridiculous." Victor gave her an incredulous look. "And what exactly do you propose?" Eleanor smirked. "I propose we stop waiting and start looking." Sir Reginald scowled. "You would be a fool to go wandering about alone." "Oh, come now, Reginald," Eleanor teased. "Afraid of the dark?" She turned, striding toward the door. Inspector Price stepped forward to stop her, but she held up a hand. "I'm a journalist," she said smoothly. "It's my job to find the truth. If you lot want to sit here in fear, go ahead. But I intend to find out exactly what's going on." Before anyone could stop her, Eleanor disappeared into the corridor. Jane sighed. "She's going to get herself killed." Price exhaled. "Then we need to follow her." But it was already too late, because just moments later a strangled cry rang out from the hall. The group rushed toward the sound, the echo of their footsteps pounding against the wooden floor. Jane reached Eleanor first. The journalist lay sprawled at the foot of the great staircase, a silk scarf wound tightly around her neck. Her body twitched once, then went still. She was dead. Jane's stomach turned. She had seen many murders in her career, but there was something deeply personal about this one. Inspector Price knelt beside her, his jaw tight. Strangled, no weapon, no noise, just quick and efficient. Sir Reginald's face had gone ashen. This was not random. Victor scowled. She was looking for trouble, and she found it. Jane frowned. Number. She found something, and that's why she was killed. As Price examined the body, something caught Jane's eye. A small torn scrap of paper clutched in Eleanor's hand. Carefully, she pried it from the journalist's stiffening fingers and unfolded it. It was a piece of an old letter. The ink faded, but a few words stood out clearly. "The debt must be paid. 5 lives for 5 sins. Jane's eyes widened. She found something. Price read over her shoulder. This must have been what she was looking for. Sir Reginald's face was unreadable. Where did she get it? Victor frowned. More importantly, who didn't want her to have it? Jane looked down at Eleanor's lifeless form, then back at the guests. The answer was in this house. The killer had made their final move. Now it was time to unmask them. Before anyone could react further, Hargreaves entered the room once more, his face pale. "Another note, sir," he said, handing it to Price. Inspector Price unfolded it slowly, his expression darkening as he read aloud. "All debts are settled. The one you seek stands among you." Jane inhaled sharply. This is it, the final act. Price straightened. Then it's time we found out exactly who has been playing God in this house. The murderer had finished their game, and now they were about to be caught. Chapter 7. The Grand Revelation. A heavy silence settled over Halloway Manor. 5 were dead: Edwin Blackwood, Dr. Francis Lindley, Mrs. Lillian Winthrop, Alfred Pemberton, and now Eleanor Marsh. The murderer had finished their work, and yet they remained among the living. The guests, now reduced to Sir Reginald Halloway, Lady Agatha Halloway, Victor Halloway, and Hargreaves the butler, stood in tense silence as Inspector Price reread the final note aloud. "All debts are settled. The one you seek stands among you." Jane Parsons glanced at the faces around her. One of these people had orchestrated everything. One of them was a cold-blooded killer. And now it was time to unmask them. Price strode toward the fireplace, his hands behind his back. "Let's go over what we know." He gestured toward Jane, who unfolded the scrap of paper they had found in Eleanor Marsh's hand before her death. "This," she said, "is a torn fragment of an old letter. Eleanor must have discovered it somewhere in the house. It reads, 'The debt must be paid, 5 lives for 5 sins.'" Victor frowned. "What does that mean?" Jane met his gaze. "It means this isn't just a random killing spree. These deaths were calculated, methodical. Each victim was chosen for a reason." She turned back to Price. "Let's break it down, Inspector." The first victim, Edwin Blackwood, the barrister, poisoned with cyanide. Price nodded. "Blackwood was a lawyer. He specialised in getting dangerous criminals acquitted." He turned towards Sir Reginald. "Sir Reginald, you had legal dealings with him, didn't you?" Sir Reginald's expression remained cold. "I hired Blackwood years ago to assist in a delicate matter." "What matter?" Jane pressed. Sir Reginald hesitated, then exhaled. "He helped bury an incident that could have ruined me." Price's jaw tightened. "An incident that involved the other victims, no doubt." Price continued with a sharp voice. "Now let's move on to Dr. Francis Lindley. He was a physician, a man of medicine, yet he was stabbed, with his own scalpel no less." Jane's eyes narrowed. "And he was involved in the same delicate matter. Blackwood helped cover up, wasn't he?" Sir Reginald did not reply. Victor's face darkened. "Lindley was a fraud, a doctor who made a fortune falsifying records, hiding evidence of malpractice, and Blackwood defended him whenever a case came too close to exposing the truth." "Which brings us to Mrs. Lillian Winthrop," Jane continued. "A widow, yes, but also a woman with many secrets. She had been blackmailing Pemberton. Why?" Price picked up the thread. "Because she knew about the scandal Sir Reginald, Lindley and Blackwood had hidden. She must have discovered the truth and held it over their heads. But she made a mistake. She let it be known that she had information." Victor let out a bitter laugh. "Which made her a liability." Jane nodded grimly. Next, we have Alfred Pemberton, the financier. He funded all of them, the doctor, the barrister, even the widow, knowing full well what was happening. He profited off the lies. Price's voice was firm. And finally, we have Eleanor Marsh, a journalist, a truth-seeker. He turned towards Sir Reginald again. She must have stumbled onto the secret recently, didn't she? Sir Reginald's expression was unreadable. Jane pressed on. She came here suspecting something, and she found it. That's why she was killed. Price exhaled. That brings us back to the beginning. Someone in this house had a reason to kill every one of these people. Someone wanted them dead, not for sport, but for retribution. The silence was suffocating. Then Jane said softly, "Lady Agatha, would you like to confess?" The room turned to the frail, shaking woman in the armchair. Lady Agatha stopped rocking. Her fingers, which had been trembling all evening, suddenly stilled. She lifted her head, and to Jane's astonishment, the fear was gone. A slow, almost serene smile spread across her lips. "You finally see it, don't you?" she whispered. Inspector Price tensed. "So it was you." Lady Agatha let out a low, breathy chuckle. "Of course it was me, Inspector. Who else would it be?" Victor stumbled back, his face contorted in shock. "Aunt Agatha, but you're—" "A frail, broken old woman?" Lady Agatha interrupted smoothly. She gave a soft sigh. "That's what you all assumed, isn't it? That I was too weak, too pitiful to do anything of consequence?" Her expression darkened. "You were all fools." Jane took a cautious step forward. "You wanted revenge." Lady Agatha's eyes flashed. "Not just revenge, Miss Parsons, justice." She turned to Sir Reginald, her voice trembling with long-buried fury. "You thought I didn't know, didn't you? You and your friends, Blackwood, Lindley, Winthrop, Pemberton, you thought you could keep your crimes hidden from me. But I knew. I always knew." Sir Reginald's face was ashen. "Agatha, Don't," she snapped. "Don't you dare apologize. It's far too late for that." She turned back to Price and Jane. "Did you ever wonder why I survived while the others died?" Jane nodded. "Because you weren't part of their conspiracy. You were innocent." Lady Agatha smiled faintly. "No, my dear, I wasn't just innocent. I was the victim." Price's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" She exhaled, looking suddenly weary. "Years ago, those 5 people destroyed my life. I was a young woman then, naive. I trusted them. I trusted my brother, my friends." Her voice hardened. "And they ruined me." She let out a bitter laugh. "It doesn't matter now. They paid for what they did, one by one." Then Jane said quietly, "You staged each death to match their crime." Lady Agatha nodded. "Poison for the barrister who twisted the law, a scalpel for the doctor who betrayed his oath, drowning for the woman who used secrets to her advantage, a bullet for the financier who profited from lies, and strangulation." She let out a small satisfied sigh. "For the journalist who got too close to the truth." Sir Reginald took a slow step back, his face ashen. "You were never weak at all, were you?" Lady Agatha tilted her head, considering him. Then she smiled. "No, dear brother, I never was." Inspector Price exhaled. "Lady Agatha Halloway, you are under arrest for 5 counts of murder." She did not protest as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Instead, she simply smiled, because in her eyes justice had already been served. Chapter 8. Justice Served. The grand halls of Halloway Manor, once symbols of wealth and power, now stood tainted by death. The fire in the drawing-room had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the cold walls as Lady Agatha Halloway sat in silence, her frail wrists shackled in cold iron. Inspector Price and Jane Parsons stood near the grand fireplace, their faces reflecting both relief and exhaustion. They had solved the mystery, but at what cost? Sir Reginald Halloway, still reeling from the revelation, sat stiffly in a chair, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at his sister, the woman he had so gravely underestimated. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hollow. "You were always quiet, Agatha, always the delicate one, and yet you—" He swallowed. "You did this." Lady Agatha smiled faintly, the firelight dancing in her cold, distant eyes. "Yes, Reginald, I did." Inspector Price folded his arms, studying Lady Agatha with a mix of admiration and disgust. "You executed 5 perfect murders, each tailored to fit the sins of your victims. You left no traces, no clear pattern until it was too late." Jane sat across from Agatha, watching her intently. "You made sure each death looked as if the victim could have been the murderer. A perfect misdirection." Agatha's lips curled. "I learned from the best, Miss Parsons. I lived in this house with liars and criminals my whole life. Did you really think I never paid attention?" Price exhaled sharply. "Let's go over the details one last time, for the record." He picked up his notebook and flipped a few pages. "You first killed Edwin Blackwood, the barrister, poisoned his brandy with cyanide." Lady Agatha nodded slowly. "Blackwood was a corrupt lawyer who twisted the law to protect criminals. He defended the people who ruined my life, knowing full well what he was doing. So I gave him justice, swift and merciless." Jane tapped her chin. "Then Dr. Francis Lindley, the physician, stabbed in the throat with a scalpel." Agatha's expression remained serene. "A doctor sworn to heal, who instead destroyed lives. Do you know what he did to me? I was ill, desperately ill. He falsified my medical records for money, told my family I was weak of mind, so they would send me away. Had I not fought to stay, I would have been locked in an institution for the rest of my life." Victor Halloway exhaled sharply. "And then you killed Mrs. Lillian Winthrop." Agatha scoffed. "A blackmailer, a woman who thrived on extortion and held secrets over the weak and desperate. She was no different from the others. She simply had no morals about whom she hurt." Inspector Price's gaze hardened. "Alfred Pemberton, you staged his death to look like a suicide." Agatha nodded. "Because that's what he made people do. He ruined countless lives, took everything from them, left them with nothing, until they saw no way out but death. I simply returned the favour." Sir Reginald was breathing heavily now, staring at his sister as if she were a stranger. "And Eleanor Marsh? What of her?" For the first time a flicker of regret crossed Agatha's features. "She was the only one who didn't deserve to die," she admitted, "but she was clever, too clever. She was going to expose everything before I was finished. I couldn't allow that." Jane's voice was quiet. "And that's why you strangled her." Agatha nodded. "It was quick, painless in comparison to the others." Inspector Price let out a breath, shaking his head. "And you would have gotten away with it too. You played the part of the frail, helpless woman so well." Agatha gave him a knowing smile. "A lifetime of practice, Inspector." Inspector Price read the Miranda rights to Agatha Holloway. The words hung in the air. Agatha simply inclined her head as though accepting a polite invitation rather than a sentence. Victor looked away as if unable to reconcile the woman before him with the aunt he had known. Sir Reginald's hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. As Price stepped forward to escort her away, she turned her gaze to Jane one last time. "You're different from the others," she murmured. "You see things others do not." Jane studied her for a long moment. "And what do you see, Lady Agatha?" Agatha smiled faintly, "that I have already won." With that she allowed herself to be led from the room, her steps slow but steady. Epilogue: the morning after. The sun rose over Halloway Manor, its light casting long golden beams through the grand windows. But it was not the same house it had been before. Where once there was grandeur, there was now only the memory of blood. Inspector Price and Jane Parsons stood on the front steps, watching as Lady Agatha was escorted into a police carriage, her expression unreadable as the doors locked behind her. Sir Reginald stood at the entrance, his face drawn with exhaustion. "She was the last person I ever suspected," he murmured. "She counted on that," Jane said softly. Victor, standing beside them, exhaled sharply. "This house, this family, we are cursed." Sir Reginald turned to Jane. "What happens now?" Jane glanced at Price, who replied, "She will stand trial. Whether the courts will convict an elderly woman, that remains to be seen." Sir Reginald's shoulders sagged. "Perhaps it's best that I leave this place. Too much death lingers here." Victor nodded grimly. "Burn it to the ground for all I care." Jane studied the old house, feeling its weight pressing down on her. Some places should be abandoned, some histories should not be preserved. Inspector Price clapped a hand on her shoulder. "We should go." She nodded. "Let's go." And together they turned away from Halloway Manor, leaving its dark secrets buried within its walls forever.